Hi, my name's Leo WT, and you have found your way to the Conversations podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome at the conversation. Hey friends, it is Leo WT. I am here and I am queer and I am escaping my Facebook ban. I had a troll report me earlier this week, which I presumably is a troll because it wasn't a inflammatory post and it had been reposted and I had no original content in the captions, but I've found a way to work around it. So I'm here live for conversations with my new friend. I actually feel, if I'm being frank, I feel like I know you a lot better than I should know you, Thomas, because I've been every day this week, I listened to a podcast with you in it and I read a chapter of God Can't. So I really feel like we're friends at this point, even though we've never met. So you found your way to conversations. Thomas has found his way to conversations, and we're going to have a good old time today. Thomas is actually an author, a theologian, an all-around chill person from what I've seen. And basically what we're going to do today is he's the guy with the answers, or at least he's not afraid to field the questions and tell you what he thinks, right? So
there you go.
A lot less pressure that way, right? But today is the day to talk about all the things you thought you couldn't in Sunday school. Thomas has dedicated his life and his spiritual quest, and he's harnessed his spiritual curiosity into kind of thinking in different and new ways about understanding the God that is talked about in the Bible. And as you know, in conversations, everybody that's watching, it is my goal, it is my expressed goal to be intersectional and interfaith. And so I wouldn't have invited Thomas on here if I felt like he was afraid of that. And so today we're going to talk about God, right? And we're going to talk about all these questions that you didn't know you need answered, the things that you got told to not ask in Sunday school. Not that happened to me, but we'll talk about this after class kind of conversation. That's what we're here for today. And Thomas is someone who has dedicated his life to this quest of spiritual curiosity. And he's been raw about it and he's been real about it. And he tackles big questions like, why does evil exist? And I'm very honored and excited to have him on. So I'm going to let Thomas give you guys a little bit more of an introduction and then we'll kind of dive in.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to have the conversation, Leo. I'm not sure there's that much more that people need to know about me, except maybe I would like to be very vulnerable right at the start and tell you what I care about the most. So like cut all the crap, go to the thing that's at the core. And for me, that has to do with love. What I want most in my life is to live a life of love, to try to love moment by moment, try to be consistent in that. I don't claim to be totally consistent in that, but that's my goal, my aim. Yeah. You know, when I die, I don't want someone to put on my grave, you know, he was a theologian or whatever. I care most about people thinking that I tried to love the best I could.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that. And I came about your work through a conversation with my friend Glenn Sieper over at the What If podcast. If you guys haven't listened to the What If podcast, very, very good stuff. Glenn is really diving deeply into the deconstruction of evangelicalism. And he's going to be on the podcast coming up soon, and I'm going to be on his. It's a good old time. But I found Thomas on there through his book, God Can't. And so the idea here is Thomas actually has a pretty interesting approach to God and an understanding of God called open and relational theology, which we'll get into as we talk. Not a theology class. I'm not trying to bombard you, but all I'm telling you is that like it might be different than what you were taught. And there might be freedom in that latitude. You know what I mean? But Thomas, when I was listening to the Deconstructionist and did a little bit more of my research and reading this week to prepare for this conversation, I saw that focus on love. And I think that is such a universal thread that pulls all senses of religion and morality and humanism forward, is that sense of love. And I think it's so powerful that you held on so tightly to that last thread that you had. You know what I mean? It really sounded like that was your thing that pulled you through. Would you mind sharing with us a little bit about like your religious background and kind of how you came to be at this place that you are now in terms of like your spiritual curiosity and understanding and such?
Sure. I grew up in a little town in eastern Washington State. My parents were very active in a local evangelical church called the Church of the Nazarene, and I was, a part of things. Was at the church a lot. Gave my heart to Jesus many times as a kid, and as I got into high school, started taking my Christian faith seriously. Went to college and began to do a lot of evangelism kinds of things because at that time in my life, I thought, well, if the most important thing is the afterlife, whether or not you go to heaven or hell, then I ought to do everything I can to try to convince people to go to the good place instead of the
Right.
bad place. And so I spent a lot of time doing that and also kind of studying, I'm sure you've had experience of this when
Mhm.
you're an evangelist and you're out trying to share your faith, you try to get all the good arguments and try to convince people by these kinds of claims, usually by appealing to the Bible. And
Mhm.
so that's what I did. And then near the end of my college career, I took a course in philosophy of religion. And in this course, for the first time, really studied the arguments of really smart people who were atheists, who were agnostics, who were from other religious traditions. And I was convinced by them, or at least I didn't have a good answer for what they proposed. And for the sake of intellectual honesty, I had to stop believing in God. I
Mhm.
called myself an atheist. I don't know if it was agnostic's a better word, but I was no longer someone who was believing in God. And for me, I come across atheists who are atheists for a variety of reasons. Some are atheists, I think, because they're just sick of the culture they've been a part of, which has been a culture, based around God. And so they're
Mhm.
basically rebelling against their culture or maybe their parents or whatever.
Mhm.
Some people I know are atheists, I think, because they've been told that they're not supposed to do X, Y, and Z. They're not supposed to sleep with people they're not married and they want to. And so they, they reject faith in God or
Right, right,
whatever.
right.
But for me, it was none of that stuff. For me, it was very intellectual. It was, look, I need to be, I want to be honest with myself. I want to have good grounds to believe that there is something like a God. And if I don't have those, well, then I just want to give up on it.
Mhm.
But I was also a person who kept at the questions, kept
Mhm.
asking. And I eventually came to the place in which I decided it was more plausible than not that there was a God. I
Mhm.
wasn't certain. I'm not certain right now there's a God.
Mhm.
But as I look at the world, I look at my life, I look at experiences, I've come to think that there likely is a God. And really it was two things that kind of brought me to this place, at least early on and
Mhm.
still today. One is I thought my life should matter, that
Mhm.
somehow life in general should matter,
Mhm.
that there ought to be some ultimate meaning in life. And without a God, I couldn't make sense of anything having ultimate meaning.
Right.
And the second one was my intuitions about love, the intuitions
Uh-huh.
I still have today.
Yeah.
That, I ought to be a loving person, other people ought to be loving. And I couldn't make sense of that intuition if there wasn't something like a source or ground of
Mhm.
love that most people call God. And
Mhm.
so that's my entry back into believing in God. And those are still pretty important to me today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was really struck by the point in your story when I was reading it on listened to it on Deconstructionist, where you described how you had to describe yourself as an atheist or at most an agnostic. And I really resonated with that because sometimes I don't like I'm starting seminary this week. I have an undergraduate degree in pastoral ministry. I have a minor in the Bible. I have on my knuckles here. I have Greek and Hebrew. Like
I love
I
it.
really drank the Kool-Aid going, from the
Yeah,
very beginning. I'm a kid who's prone to just obeying authority and just like overachieving, like just doing it. And I don't now at this point in my life, I don't know, like I stumble over the word Christian, but
sure.
there's something that's there that's stuck in me,
Yeah,
and it's deeper or broader or different somehow than what I was taught.
Mm,
but it's connected to what I felt in those moments where I felt like I was really experiencing something in those Christian and religious circles. And so for me, I've spent my life trying to life since I came out and was kind of excommunicated from evangelicalism. I've been trying to figure out what that means, right?
yeah.
And I loved that love pulled you through, first of all. And I also loved that you're like, I have to be intellectually honest.
Right.
I feel like that's a classification that just doesn't necessarily exist, especially in like Western evangelical Christianity, but in a lot of religions in general. I
Sure.
mean, there's this kind of beef that you have to really check your brain at the door. And I love that you weren't afraid of that. You were like, let's work with our brains. Like, if we're supposedly divinely created, then why would we just have to shut off our logic to move forward in this relationship? So what really pulled you back from that? Would you mind like just diving in a little bit more? Was it that connection to love, or, you say that you don't necessarily like fully know if there is a God now, but what
No,
brought you
no.
back to where you are, you know what I mean? Where you are religiously and spiritually and just morally as a person? Like, how did you come back to where you are and find validity in staying in a religion that is problematic?
Yeah, yeah. Well, man,
It's
we
a
could
big one,
talk all
right?
day about this, but
I know.
I talk to a lot of people who are self-identified as atheists or are flirting with atheism,
Hmm.
and when I talk to them, many of them are in the position they're in because they've come to believe that what they were taught in the past doesn't make a lot of sense.
Hmm.
Maybe it's some doctrine, or maybe it's a way of living, and they know that's not right, and so they're now identifying as an atheist.
Hmm.
And for those people, I encourage them to really go all the way.
Hmm.
Don't be a half-ass atheist. Go if
That's going on a t-shirt. Don't be a half-ass atheist.
I mean, if you're going to go down that road, go
Yeah.
the whole route
Yeah.
and then try to figure out what life is going to be like as a full-blown atheist.
Absolutely.
And what I find for myself and for lots of other people, that once you kind of get to their place where there's nothing else,
Hmm.
and you try to live your life, you start making all of these judgments, like about what's valuable, what's
Hmm.
meaningful, how you ought to live. You get mad at the president because he does something you think is immoral, and then you think to yourself, well, what basis do I have to make some kind of claim that it's immoral? Or
Yep.
somebody does something bad to you and you think, well, that's not right. And you think, well, hold on a second. If there's no God, then there is no ultimate right. It's just whatever my opinion is. Or
Right.
these all these kinds of things. We think our lives matter sometimes. Our
Hmm.
choices have meaning.
Hmm.
But if you're a true full-blown atheist, it's hard to have a fundamental basis for those beliefs.
Hmm.
You might just say, well, I have them because they're just, um, leftovers from my past, or, I just the way I've learned to function in the world. But if you want to have a robust picture of reality, a robust way of thinking, if you want to be rationally coherent,
Hmm.
I think you have to start asking questions that lead many people back to some kind of belief in God.
Yeah.
But if you're like me, the God you end up believing in is not the God you used to believe in. You're not
Right.
going back to the crap that you had before. Not that
Mhm.
everything you were taught was crap, but
Right. Right.
you're going back to maybe some things, but there's other also going to be some pretty radical differences as you
Hmm.
start to reconstruct, is the word many people use today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't really know that deconstruction and reconstruction were a thing until I've been doing it for a decade. So I'm a little late on the trending hashtag. I just thought I was kind of just muddling my way through this space,
Yeah.
where I only really understood myself to be post-Christian. For some reason, I'm just a pesky little theist, no matter what. Like, I couldn't get away from
Yeah.
the idea of some sort of like divine, overarching, transcendent,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily always know what it is. But I couldn't get away from theism because like you said, just logically, if there are moral mandates, and what really was interesting to me being a nerd is like you see these same moral mandates and little bits present in all civilizations, right? look at native culture, right? Look at African tribal cultures, look at all of the different Abrahamic religions, certainly look at even the newer religions that have developed that don't descend into drinking grape Kool-Aid in Jonestown. You know what I mean? But like there's a core tenet of those, right? And
Yeah.
the core tenet of a cult is a charismatic person that's, you know, isolationary and exclusionist. But the core tenet of these other morality systems and religious systems and ways of being is that there is some sort of moral mandate. There is some sort of overarching love. Um, and there's just something there. And I couldn't get away from that, you know?
Mm,
So I think for me, when I come back to like why believe in God, for me, I just couldn't not if I was intellectually honest.
yeah.
I
Yep.
couldn't not. And I feel like the transcendent thing like makes sense because there's so much about this world that like I don't understand, but it's too I and maybe this is once again my bent in life, but it's there's too much organization, too much synchronicity for it to be random, you know.
Right. That's another big issue. There's a lot of beauty in the world. There is a lot
Mm-hmm.
of order and design.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the biggest arguments against the idea that there is a foundation for beauty or an orderer we call God is that there's also a lot of pain, suffering, and evil in the world. And
Exactly.
and I think if you're going to be have a what we called earlier a plausible or a robust understanding of God and the world, you can't just look at all the rosy stuff. You got to
Right.
look at the crap too.
Yeah.
But you also can't just look at the crap.
Right. Right. Right.
Like the number one reason most atheists don't believe in God, at least according to polls, is the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the problem of good.
Right.
If there is no God, then why the heck is there so much goodness and beauty and truth in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if you're going to be seriously honest about life as you see it, you have to give an answer for both the good and the bad.
Yeah, I love that. Sometimes I'm a verbal agreeer, but maybe it's because I like grew up a portion of my childhood in Southern Ohio, sort of tent revival Pentecostal situations where you just
Sure.
gotta yes and amen and like wave a hanky all the time. But I'm a verbal agreeer, and in Zoom land, I have to be a little bit less. But I agree with that statement so much. You can't truncate the good from the bad, no matter what your belief system is. You have to come to a place where you can hold space for an understanding of good and bad. And I sometimes I shy away from the word evil because it's so just cased in religious dogma.
Sure.
But I mean, you know, there is good and there is bad. And I don't you have to hold space for both of those. So you
Yeah.
talk, you know, obviously your book God Can't is we could talk for hours just about that. But could you maybe give us just like sort of the you know, I know there's 5 things in there, right? And kind of a description of how you explain that God can't, because so many people think like the problem of evil, like if there's a good God, why does XYZ happen? Can you give us like a little intro to that, and then we'll kind of follow whatever threads come up?
Sure. Many people who wrestle with this question, why there's evil in the world or in my life, if God is truly loving and truly powerful, many, after they wrestle with it for a while, just kind of throw in the mystery card.
Mm-hmm.
If they continue to believe in God, they don't have a good answer for it. And so they reach into their back pocket, pull out this big old honking mystery card and clunk it right in the middle of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's supposed to be satisfying in some way. And it's not satisfying for me.
It is not satisfying at all.
No, I mean, it's better than the cliche answers like, God needed another angel in heaven. That's why your sister was raped and killed. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
just makes no sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I want something better than mystery. And so I have for quite some time been working at this and finally come to a place where I think God is active in the world. God loves everyone all the time, but God simply does not have the power to control any person, any other creature, any circumstance. God is active and influential in all circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
but God can't, by very nature, control anyone or anything.
Mm.
And a lot of people have kind of toyed with the idea that maybe God isn't in control, and they'll say things like, well, God didn't want that to happen, but God allowed it or God permitted it because, either God's got a plan for it or, maybe God just didn't want to interrupt that guy's free will when he had the gun and shot all the people, whatever
Mhm.
they have.
Mhm.
And that whole allow or permit, that just
Mhm.
doesn't work for me
Mhm.
because I know that if I am in a situation in which I could exert influence to stop evil, but I allow it, then no one's going to call me loving for not stopping something that's horrific when I could have.
Right.
And if we have those kind of standards for us, we ought to apply that same standard to God.
Yeah, absolutely. I just found this idea of open and relational theology. I found it as a dovetail to I was looking at process theology, which I'll be looking up
Yes.
for the next 175 years until I understand it. But for those of you who aren't theology nerds, there is a very common sort of Nicene Creed, Catholic Church, basic Protestant way of like understanding God. But what's so cool about what Thomas is doing, and there are other theologians out there, he's certainly not the first, and I really hope he won't be the last, but they're playing with, and I say playing because you can have spiritual curiosity and you can question and test and push the boundaries of what you know. I think if there is a God, God in fact would want us to play around with our understanding so that we really did. But what Thomas is kind of talking about is this idea that God is interactional and relational, and God is, instead of this idea of God being like all powerful and omnipotent and everything, like God is relational and impacted by relationship with us as we are impacted by relationship with God. And just speaking, directly at you again, Thomas, that is very redemptive for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like when you look at evil in the world, God either seems like that problem of why did God allow evil? God is either aloof and he has no idea what his kids are doing in the other room, or he's just a dick. Like, you
Right.
know what I mean? You can't like, oh, I just allowed a mass shooting. Like, that's not something or someone or some unit, like an entity that I want to believe in. That's gross. Gross. Like, why? Like, why?
Yeah.
Would you be able to? Once again, I know this is like an hour and a half seems like a long podcast, but it's not really once you get into a good conversation. But could we open up the fire hydrant a little bit? And can you explain to me how you came to this idea of
Mm.
like a neo postmodern understanding of God's character, and like how God in fact is a relational, has
Sure.
transactional relationships with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways to answer this, but
Hmm.
I think since I was a kid, I was wrestling with these big questions
Hmm.
and kind of feeling for answers. As a
Hmm.
kid, maybe in high school or college, what we call the free will defense seemed to be the
Hmm.
best idea. So, you ask the question, why did the kid get tortured?
Yeah.
Well, the kid got tortured because his parents freely chose to torture him. God
Hmm.
didn't cause it, but God allowed it.
Hmm.
Well, I never felt good about the allow stuff.
Hmm.
And so that made me push to think more about other ways in which God might not be able to stop not only free will creatures, but other animals,
Hmm.
cells in our body.
Hmm.
Something would come up like, oh, I don't know, let's take a miscarriage.
Hmm.
You know, I know people who've had multiple miscarriages. Well, do they have miscarriages because of their free will? They're using their freedom wrongly? No,
Yep.
not the vast majority of time. That's not it.
Hmm.
And so, if God can really control what's happening in a woman's uterus, God can really control the cells, then why wouldn't a loving God prevent these miscarriages?
Hmm.
So I then had to say, okay, maybe God's also not controlling at that level of reality.
Hmm.
And along the way, I did a lot of thinking about God being relational, and
Hmm.
it might surprise many of your listeners and viewers to find out that if you look at the major theologians, Christian mostly, but there are some Jewish theologians as well, they have thought that God is not relational. They've thought that God doesn't have any compassion.
Hmm.
God's not affected at all by what we do because they've thought that God had to be perfect. And in their view, a perfect being would be unaffected by anything, would be,
Hmm.
as the word you used, aloof.
Hmm.
This God is unmoved. Now, this is not the God that I find described in most of the Bible. but it's the way a lot of professional theologians have thought about God. And I just came to the place where I thought, not only in the name of scripture, but in the name of just what seems like to be a loving person, God's got to be a relational, giving and receiving with me in the midst of my joy and my pain. But that view that God is relational, it's starting to come back. It's pretty strong, even in the academy. But a lot of people who have that view still hold on to the back of their mind that God has the kind of omnipotent power that if God really wanted to help her out, God really wanted to rescue them, God could single-handedly. It would be like, let's say you and I are, oh, I don't know. Where are you at? Where do you live now?
I live in Western New York, about a
Western New
decade
York.
away from New York City.
Okay, well, let's say you and I meet up in New York City
Mhm,
for a coffee because we're both in the city, and we're having coffee when all of a sudden one of the gas lines explodes,
mhm,
and the building starts to come down, and we're both trying to get out of the way, and I make it safely out, but a big beam comes down and lands right on your chest.
mhm.
And I crawl back over to you amidst the rubble, and you look up at me, and I can see that if you don't get this beam off your chest, you're going to suffocate, you're going to
Mhm.
die. And you say to me, Tom, help me out here. Now, if I just kind of got down next to you and said, hey, Leo, I'm with you right now, I could push this beam off and save your life, but
Uh-huh.
I'm just going to hold my hand here and be with you when you take your last breath.
Uh-huh.
I would be relational. I
Yeah.
would be feeling this thing.
Yeah.
But if I had the real power to save you and didn't, you wouldn't think I was very loving, and your
No.
family wouldn't either.
No. Not at
And
all.
so we've got to go farther than just saying God is relational. As important as that is, I'm totally on board with that. You know, I'm a relational theologian. We
Mhm.
have to go farther and say, not only is God relational, but God can't
Mhm.
single-handedly rescue us. Because if God could, God's doing a piss poor job in the world right now.
Yeah, that's a terrible commentary on the nature of God. If God could but doesn't, that's sadistic. That's all. That's a
Right.
guy with an ant farm.
Exactly. We wouldn't say a human who had the power to prevent evil and doesn't is loving. So why say God can be like that?
Right. And I think there's plenty of times in Christian scripture, certainly, and definitely in the Torah, the Jewish Bible, and from the little bit I've read in the Quran, there's plenty of moments where God is is personified, like takes on human emotions, like the God of the Old Testament. Like, dude, that guy needed a counselor. He was up and down, like he's dashing babies' heads off rocks, and he's like, there's just, it's problematic. We'll talk about that in a minute, probably, but like, there is evidence that God has these personified transactional feelings,
Right,
and to me,
right.
that's comforting because if God doesn't have that interactional element, then he's like kind of like a psychopath. You know what I mean? Meaning that in the
Right.
truest sense of the word, with no emotion, right? And that's
Yep.
strange. I don't know why
Yeah,
we.
I mean, one of the ongoing tasks I think of people who believe in God, and especially professional theologians like me, is we have to try to read through the biblical texts and try to make sense of our lives in such a way that we can make sense of when people. Well, let's just use scripture. When
Hmm.
biblical writers sometimes portray God as actually evil,
Hmm.
like, what do you do with that? I
Yeah.
mean, if
Yeah.
you're a serious reader of the Bible like I am, you either have to think God has split personality disorder that,
Hmm.
sometimes is really nice and loving, other times kicks your butt for
Yeah.
whatever reason. Or another idea, of course, is just to say there is no God and it's people just making stuff up.
Hmm.
I've already talked about the problem with that view.
Hmm.
My perspective is to say the dominant witness of the scriptures points to a God of steadfast, perfect, intimate love.
Hmm.
But there are some portraits in the Bible that don't portray God that way.
Hmm.
And I'm willing to dismiss those. I'm willing to say those passages just get God wrong.
Hmm.
Just like sometimes people today misunderstand God, even the writers of the Bible sometimes misunderstood
Yeah.
God.
I feel like that was a big beginning point for me. Now that
Mm,
I'm a verbal processor, so I'm processing some
yeah.
of this as we're talking. But I think one
Yes.
of my first step to deconstruction was the very clear simultaneous realizations that I was gay and that God loved me. I tried.
Mm.
I'm a very stubborn person, and so I let myself be privy to not one but three exorcisms. And in looking back, that's definitely spiritually abuse. But I wasn't
Yeah.
going to let anybody say that I didn't try. Okay.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. I totally get that. Yep.
So I did it. I let it happen. And then the weekend after my last exorcism, God, that's the phrase I never thought I'd say publicly. The weekend after my last exorcism, what, that's fucking ridiculous. I went to this retreat for a class of mine, which is called Personal Spiritual Formation. In hindsight, the class is incredibly spiritually abusive because they play around with psychological concepts, but they do them without trained counselors there. Whatever, different
Yeah.
podcast. But on that retreat, I was doing an intentional fast from talking. I'm a talker. I'm a communicator. That's like what I do.
Yeah.
That is my main strength, is communicating. And so the idea behind it was that I would take a minute and intentionally silence myself for 48 hours to kind of experience what the divine might be telling me in that moment.
Mm.
Abusive or not at the moment, it did lead to the punchline of this story, which is I was on some solo time at a monastery outside New York City, Bear Mountain, by myself in the woods, just kind of trying to listen and feel. And I had just come out, and it had gone about as well as you would imagine. It had gone at an evangelical Christian college.
Yeah.
In the silence, I had this period of solo time. I think it was like 6 hours, just me and nature and nothing else. And all I could hear over and over in my head was, I love you just as you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so the beginning of my deconstruction was whatever voice was speaking to me. I
Mm-hmm.
still default to Christianity because that's my first language in terms of religion.
Yeah.
But in that moment, I truly felt that divinity was reaching down to me and saying, like, you simultaneously are gay and are loved. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was that was probably the linchpin in my deconstruction, because that was diametrically opposed to what I had been taught.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the next thing that came for me was this idea of biblical inerrancy. And my friends and I used to joke that they had bugs in the dorms, and you couldn't say the phrase without getting called to the dean's office. Like, don't say the phrase biblical inerrancy, or you will get in trouble.
I love it.
So we would like joke around about it. We actually had like an underground LGBTQ group that met at Nyack, and we didn't have a formal meeting time or place. It would just be me and my friend, and we'd call a meeting for the next 24 hours, and we'd be like, meet by this tree. But we were literally that underground at that point, and we were the same way with biblical inerrancy. But once I let go of the idea of the Bible being the inerrant word of God,
Mm-hmm.
it was terrifying at the time, because that's what I've been taught.
Yes.
But it was also freeing, because I didn't have to fucking answer for those scary ass Old Testament stories anymore. I didn't have to be an apologist for those. The Old Testament was a weird time, and I was freed a little bit by realizing that the Bible, I think God inspired. I think the Bible is divinely inspired, but it was written by fallible humans, and then it's been translated over and over and over again by fallible humans. So it's a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy. And there are things that culturally don't make sense anymore, and there are things that definitely don't make sense if you don't understand the context of the writers, and there are things that were put in there by people who paid for them to be put in there. I said what I said. You know what I mean? Like, homosexuality as a concept, consensual homosexuality is just not in the Bible. And so once I let go of the idea of biblical inerrancy, that was my second deconstructive process. And I think you have to be able to reconcile with that in order for me to take you seriously as a Christian. You have to.
Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah, it was a big thing for me too. As you were telling your story, though, I was thinking that you and I, and probably everyone who's listening and watching this, we've probably have histories in which people have done and said things to us that have not been good.
Mm-hmm.
They've screwed us up.
Yep.
And it's easy, I think, for some people to be bitter about that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people have done things to me, harm me on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times people do it just because they don't know any better. You
Yes.
know,
Yep.
their motives are actually pretty good. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
they have these, they probably kind of swallow some of their feelings
Mm-hmm.
that say, don't say what I'm about to say. And they say it because they think they're
Yeah.
doing the right thing. You know,
Absolutely.
I did that myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm ashamed of it, but I did it.
Yep.
And so, as part of forgiving others for what they've done to me, I've also had to forgive myself for what
Mm-hmm.
I did to others. And I'm not saying that's easy.
Right.
I'm not saying, you know, people aren't to blame.
Right.
Um, that's helped me
Yeah.
to do the hard work of retaining the wheat, the
Mm-hmm.
good stuff from my past,
Mm-hmm.
and burning the bad stuff
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
trashing that. And
Yeah.
it's still a process.
Yeah.
I haven't
Absolutely.
got it all figured out, but I've made, I think, some significant improvements over time.
Yeah. And I think that's there's kind of this overall philosophical question, like anybody who's taken philosophy 101 at a liberal arts school, you've heard this question, like, is the nature of humans to do good, or, you know, or is it fallible, right? Are humans good or bad? Are humans collaborative or competitive? And I think I have to say that in looking back, I don't think that most of these motivations of the folks that had harmed me were for bad. And for example, I'll use my mom. My mom's a dope ass human. She's coming on the podcast on Mother's Day. We are going to have a good old time. But my
I've
mom,
never said that my mom's a dope ass human. I'm gonna have to pull that one.
you got to pull that one out. You got to pull that one out. Yeah, I'm sure my mom will be infinitely proud if she listens. My mom is a great human. Like, she's a little crazy, but everybody's mom is a little crazy, right? But what my mom does really well is love. And
Mm,
particularly her children. And she's always been a good mom. And she's
mm,
never done anything intentionally that she thought would harm us. And in me
yeah,
coming out didn't go well. And my mom's also very stubborn. And so we had
yeah,
some go rounds. But
sure.
about 2-3 months ago, my mom called me and she apologized to me for what
Wow.
happened when I came out. And she was crying, and she had listened to one of my previous videos, which I was scared to put out because it was so honest. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But she said, I'm not perfect. I failed you, and I will fail you again in the future. But I want you to know I'm sorry, and that I never did anything because I didn't love you. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I feel like if you can let go, and this all ties to me to the idea of biblical inerrancy, because like if you can let go of that idea of infallibility, you can
Mm,
create space in your head for a philosophy and a theology that allows for imperfection,
yeah.
with but doesn't condemn a person based on a presumption of bad intention. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's
Um,
nicely. Yeah. Well said.
it was great. It was really, really freeing. I didn't know it was ever going to happen. So I'm,
Yeah.
man, I love that woman. She's, like I said, she's crazy, but it's like the scene in Stranger Things where they're like, this is our friend and she's crazy. Like, she could be crazy, but we love her. I imagine people say that about me. So
Yeah.
how do
Well, one of
you
the,
go ahead?
oh,
No, you go.
I was, okay. One of the, I talked earlier about God can't prevent
Hmm.
evil single-handedly, and why that's important for me and for many people. I think it's a growing number of people to understand why there's evil in the world and how there's a loving God.
Hmm.
But there's another side of this that's also been important to me, and it goes to the question of whether or not my life has meaning. My
Hmm.
choices are really significant.
Hmm.
I've always had a sense that it does have meaning, that my
Hmm.
choices do matter. I mean, the whole world doesn't revolve around me, but that,
Right.
choices I make a difference.
Hmm.
But if you have a view of God, that God is in control of things, that God, is really the one who's making the decisions and you just think you are,
Hmm.
then it's hard to take life very seriously as having ultimate meaning. And even if you have a God who doesn't control you, but could, or maybe, occasionally steps in and single-handedly bangs out a miracle here and there all alone, then you start to get, at least I start to get the feeling that, well, if God really truly wants something to happen, if it's really important ultimately, then God will make sure it happens, even if it has to be done single-handedly on God's part.
Hmm.
But that then undermines my sense of what's valuable and significant. So
Right.
it's a long way of saying, I think if you really believe life matters, your life matters,
Hmm.
you make meaningful decisions, you should also believe that God can't control you at any time. That means that the future is in part dependent upon what you do. And that means that for love to win, God has to somehow convince you to cooperate. And to me, at least, that makes for a more meaningful understanding of my life and life in general.
Yeah, that's so true. That's it's so logical. Like, and I haven't gone down that road intellectually in my mind, but that's incredibly true. There's so many. I think sometimes people don't realize like your belief in one thing is it's a Jenga tower, and
Mm,
when you grow up with these fundamental understandings of certain things, and then you challenge them, the tower falls down, but it can be rebuilt. That's a really interesting point about like if God can change it all, what the hell is the point of what I'm doing? You know what I
right,
mean?
right.
I've never thought about that logically, and I'm going to be chewing on it for weeks because that makes so much sense. Because I too have always had this understanding of my life having purpose. Now,
Yeah,
I've had to deconstruct it from evangelicalism, where
sure.
it was grandiose and I was going to go save people across the ocean and maybe I'll be a martyr. Literally, like that's something that was like championed, right, in the church I
Right.
grew up in. But even once I stepped outside from that, I still felt like that sense of purpose or calling. Um, and so that the idea that God can't is actually wildly redemptive of my sense of calling because it's motivational in a way. Like I need to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And
Well, I
those
like
things,
that.
I think, oh, I'm sorry.
I just said I like that.
Yeah. I want to kind of go, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
kind of come back to what I said at the very start. These ideas that God can't prevent evil single handedly, that God can't stop you from doing things, that your choices really matter, to me, fit hand in glove with my intuitions about love. That
Mhm.
love is the answer. You don't have to be a Christian to think that love is at the source of things.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've written books on and compared other religious traditions. And while love is not as prominent in some of the other major religious traditions, there's still talk about love.
Mhm.
Love is universal in that sense. Now, we have different understandings sometimes of what love entails, but this fundamental intuition that we ought to do good to each other, to ourselves, to our enemies, to strangers, to the planet, that's something I think is deeply ingrained in all of us. And I think, and I could be wrong, but I think the source of the intuitions you and I and everyone who's listening to this have about love have a God of love as their moment by moment source. I
Mhm.
can't prove that.
Mhm.
I don't know it with absolute certainty, but I think it's the most reasonable account of my life and the world that I find before me.
Mhm. Yeah, that's man, I'm never lost for words ever. Like not since I've been speaking. But like it's so I was thinking to myself, like, I wish I could just sit in a class of yours or hear you preach or something. And I feel like we're having this moment right now because you're saying so many things that for
Mm.
me are honestly helping me on my reconstruction journey, which is
Mm.
still in its infancy.
Yeah.
I think one other thing, and I'm like just pulling out of my own head right now, not even off any list of questions, but I had a friend on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Amazing human. I mean, one of the most impactful humans in my life. We met when we were in an evangelical circle. I was doing an internship at a church in Harlem. We worked together there, and I recently like reconnected with her. Not, I've never been deconnected from her, but I was like, hey, let's get you on the podcast, and she was a little worried because she has come to a place where she understands herself to be like an atheist. And she was like worried about coming on. I was like, no, dude, get on. Like, I want to hear what you think. Like, I'm not gonna be thrown by it. Like, I just want to hear what my really smart friend has to say. And she brought up a point about how she doesn't feel so comfortable with the idea of using the word love because it has been so misused. Because so
Sure.
many people have done bad things in the name of love. And so her kind of universal mandate that she functions around at the moment is do what is safest for those around you. And I
Mm.
thought that was really interesting because like we have all seen instances, especially in churches, where what is loving looks more like a sledgehammer than a hug.
Right. Yeah.
Like we've all seen it. And so what are your thoughts on that? I mean, because love is your thing, right? So what do you
Yeah.
think about
Yeah.
like when people misuse the word love? You know what I mean? Like how does that what are your
Oh,
thoughts on that?
yeah. Love is one of the multi-meaning word I've written. I wrote a whole book called Defining Love. So
Okay. Perfect.
I've thought an awful lot about this question.
Just a tad.
Um, yeah. Um, so yeah, I think when we use the word, we ought to try to give a definition to be clear what it is. And just for the sake of you and the people who are listening to this, I define love as acting intentionally in response to others, including God, since I believe in God,
Mhm.
to promote overall well-being. So love
Okay.
is about promoting well-being. Now,
Mhm.
sometimes that promoting well-being is do no harm,
Mhm.
is, be safe. And I'm on board with that. But I actually think sometimes love also is risky.
Mhm.
That sometimes you can't play it safe.
Mhm.
I'm not saying you should go harm people, but I'm saying that sometimes you have to take a risk that, well, maybe I could put it this way. As you know, one of the most common biblical language or biblical phrases is do unto others as you would have done unto you.
Mhm.
In some of the other religious traditions, that phrase or that thing is said, don't do to others what you don't want them to do
Mhm.
to you. And that's kind of like this safety thing that sounds to me like
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
friend is saying.
Mhm.
But there's a difference between avoiding harming and proactively trying to do good to others.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes it is taken too far. Sometimes people are trying to do good and they end up doing harm. I'm not dismissing that at all. But I have a more proactive approach, I think,
Mhm.
than what at least strikes me when I hear someone say safety rather than love.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, also safety wins is just not a good t-shirt, so
I love it.
yeah, no, that train of conversation really struck me though because it does at least force us to reconcile with the fact that people have done a lot of unloving things in the name
Oh,
of
no
love,
doubt
and that's
about that.
something that needs to be reconciled. And
Yeah.
I just think that you so many people conflate their opinion with what God said. And if your basis is flawed and you're a fallible human, shit can go really sideways. You know what I
Yeah, yeah,
mean? One of the questions on here that I really wanted to ask you on the list, as it's just kind of picking through them, we've covered most of them to be honest, but
okay.
one of them is um does the church have any moral authority given its complicity in slavery, anti-LGBTQ actions and rhetoric, and not sheltering immigrants? Now, this is a big question for me because it actually it brings into play something I've been thinking very deeply about lately, something I'm actually writing about at the moment. The idea of Christian religion versus Christian culture, because I think a lot of times the culture of the church is what has been racist and homophobic and xenophobic. I think a lot of times the culture of the church is that, but they're really reading from a different playbook in terms of how they're interpreting it. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think moral authority is given,
Mm-hmm.
it shouldn't be imposed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are lots of people who still think the church has moral authority. Lots of people don't think it does. So I don't, I can't make an overarching kind of
Right.
claim. Does it? It kind of depends on who you are and your experience with the church.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I do think, though, that it's much less common today for
Mm-hmm.
people to just assume the church is right or your pastor is right or your
Mm-hmm.
community is right. And part of the reason for that is not just all the stuff that you mentioned that the church has sucked at and made mistakes on, has hurt people over.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is just that thanks to the internet, we have a much broader awareness of the world and what other people think. when I was a kid, if I wanted to find out what a Buddhist thought, I couldn't go to the internet.
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
I just didn't have much awareness of religious diversity. I knew about these other religions, but
Mhm.
most of what I know was just, preachers or Christian musicians making fun
Right.
of the Muslims or
Yep.
whatever.
Yep.
I just didn't know anybody personally, and I didn't see a video in which someone was authentic.
Yeah.
So in a world in which we have so much more access to good and bad sources, not just
Hmm.
all good,
Yep.
it's harder and harder for any one or any group or any organization to have true authority
Hmm.
unless that group, individual, or organization does something that we find valuable. And then all of a sudden we place some authority in them. So,
Hmm.
you look at, just yesterday, I was out hiking, and usually on my hikes, I listen to podcasts on my way out, and I happened to turn on Rob Bell's latest
Hmm.
podcast.
Hmm.
Rob Bell is a moral authority for a lot of people.
Hmm.
For other people, he's just a heretic.
I love it. He is.
uh,
He is for so many people.
right. So why is that? Well, it's because that Rob and his ideas have been helpful to a lot of people.
Mhm.
And so they now give him a kind of moral authority.
Mhm.
Can the church regain that or have that or somehow establish that moral authority? I suspect it's possible.
Mhm.
I think in today's world, it's probably more likely on a smaller, more local level.
Yeah. Yep.
Your church down the street's doing a really bang up job. You like
Mhm.
the pastor and the people. You're going to give them a kind of authority.
Mhm.
But hey, maybe you think that Christianity in general is mostly going to hell in a handbasket.
Mhm.
And, so that it's just going to vary.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty astute observation, and I think that might be, I think there's some roles of generational differences in there too.
Sure.
When I was maybe 16, full disclosure, I'm just a super nerd. When I was 12, I was at Bible camp, and my brother bought Sea Monkeys, and I bought the Fourfold Gospel.
I love it.
It's this book like this thick, and I was like, could you believe this was on the clearance rack? You know what I mean?
I love it.
Man, I lost where I was going with that, but there's just a lot of, I think there's a lot of, postmodernism. There's a lot of difference between people of different generational affiliations, right? And definitely something that happened when our world moved from like a boomer modernistic mindset into a postmodern mindset is I think that people value relationships much more than they value institutional authority. And so I think if anything, like, I don't think the church needs to have moral authority. I think people need to stand up and live a life that proves that they should be listened to or at least trusted.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you.
I mean, that's how Jesus did it. Jesus didn't go to the institution of the day and be like, give me your moral authority. Jesus empowered people to baptize people in puddles and then send them away from the temple. Right. And I don't mean that to be anti-Semitic because there's so much richness to Judaism. And frankly, I think there's a lot of ways that Judaism got it right and we messed it up. You know what I mean? But the metaphor being that this person who was revolutionary gave authority and empowerment to people and then sent them away from the establishment to go out and reach the people that the establishment was never going to be able to go to because the establishment doesn't have feet. And I think that's a lot more of a return to what the gospel actually was, which was just people in their daily lives doing good shit and bringing the kingdom of heaven to now and not worrying about an afterlife,
Yeah.
I think that postmodernity doesn't really have a need for a moral authority in a church, but postmodernity does value people who do what they say they're going to do. Rob Bell definitely impacted me in that way because he challenged me to think differently about how I believed certain things in the Bible. I had never thought about like universal salvation. I actually now proudly wear the title of heretic. I actually have a hat that says heretic. I'm all about it because a heretic is just someone who pushed on the edges of their faith to see what needed to be more fully developed or understood. Dude, I'm down with that. I am down with intellectual integrity, even if it pushes me to uncomfortable places, which it sure has, so.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to make a comment that wasn't all that important. So.
Oh, it's all good. So there's some of this stuff about Christians in here, which I think the idea of holding, I think there's a delineation between church culture and church as a religion. So I'm going to shelve those because that's a conversation I'm going to bring up at another time, like to dive
Okay.
into more. But one thing that someone mentioned on here, and I really liked your description of this in God Can't, was the idea of the purpose of prayer. So would you kind of
Mm,
give us, like, you had some really interesting ideas about what prayer is and isn't, and how it can be beneficial for us. And for me, full disclosure, I consider prayer to be a much broader thing than I was taught.
sure.
You had some great thoughts on this on the Deconstructionist, so I'm not going to steal your thunder. But what's the purpose of creating a transactional or relational moment with divinity?
Hmm.
And we can call it prayer for the sake of this conversation. But what's the purpose or function of that? That in your eyes?
Well, if you take relational theology seriously, what you do really makes a difference to God, and what God does makes a difference to you. So, what God chooses to do in the next moment depends in part what you chose to do in the previous moment. That means your choices really make a difference. And that then helps me to make sense of prayer, even prayer to a God who I think can't single-handedly fix things. So let me explain what that looks like,
Yeah.
and I think the best way to do it is kind of compare it to some other ways people think about God and prayer. And by prayer here, you used the word transaction.
Mhm.
I'm going to use the word petitionary prayer. So
Perfect.
asking God to do something, which
Mhm.
is a common way people pray. So obviously, if you have like a Calvinist view of God, in which God controls absolutely everything and predestined it from the foundations of the world, it's hard to get motivated to pray
Yeah.
because basically everything's already been settled. My prayer is not going to change anything in the future.
Yeah.
God's already predetermined it all. So, I mean, I'm not saying Calvinists don't pray. I'm just saying intellectually, it's not to me a very coherent system in thinking about
Mhm.
prayer and God. Most people I don't know don't have that view. They have the view that God could single handedly fix things, and God wants to be asked before God's going to get off his butt and do something,
God's
to put it
God is
simply.
petty.
That's right. Yeah. It's like God's folded arms sitting
Yeah.
back and saying, Leo, you haven't asked me to do this, or you haven't asked me enough times. You've prayed about this 6 times, but
Yep.
I need 60 times, or,
Yeah, God is that parent or English teacher is like, can you or may you? And you just want to punch him in the face. That's what it
uh,
seems like if God could do everything and he's just chilling, waiting for you to ask for it. Like, what a douche.
right, right. That makes no sense
No.
whatsoever. If God can single handedly do anything, and God is truly loving,
Mhm.
not only would God not make you ask a bunch of times, why would you even have to ask at all?
Yep.
I mean, if God really knows what's best and really loves you, I mean, think about what your good parents, when they have an infant who, let's say, is a 1 year old, can't talk, they're not waiting for their kid to ask them to help them out with something. They feed them, they bathe them, they do the
Yep.
things that are loving, even though the kid 1 year old can't ask.
Yep.
Um, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. So, what a lot of people will do, especially people who have prayed and realized that their prayers haven't had the desired results that they want, they're like me and they've prayed for people to be healed, and very few get healed, and they're honest about that. Then they kind of have a view that God doesn't really get affected by their prayers. God doesn't answer prayers. And I hear this especially in more progressive churches that I preach in. They'll say things like, well, prayer doesn't change God, it changes me. And what they have in mind is they don't want to think that somehow their prayer is going to get God off his butt, because they
Mhm.
don't, that doesn't sound right. And they've been burned by praying for, healings that haven't happened, and they think God wants healings.
Yeah.
So they just think, well, God doesn't really respond to our prayers, but God or we get changed. Our mind, our way of thinking, whatever, it changes.
Mhm.
Now, I'm all about us being changed by prayers, but I think there's more than that. And as a
Mhm.
relational theologian, I have a way of thinking about it. So this is my view.
Mhm.
Our prayers in one moment make an impact upon God and actually present new possibilities for God in the next moment.
Mm-hmm.
Because we live in a relational universe and God's a relational God, our actions make a real difference to us, to our environment, and to God, such that the future, in the next moment and future moments, can really be different because we prayed in the previous moment. It doesn't mean that our prayers somehow make God be turbocharged, that God can now control us or control others when God couldn't before we ask. I'm not saying that. I don't believe God can control. But I am saying that just like in our own relationships, if we get new information from someone in our family, that affects how we then act in the future moments if we're truly loving.
Yeah.
And that's the way it works with God, except obviously, I believe God is omnipresent. So God has a much more influence in the world than you and I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I really vibe with that because I feel like it just makes sense. Like there's a participatory nature to God. Otherwise, what's the point in us believing at all? Like
Yeah.
if God just is and he's up there like whatever, what's the point? That's why I could
Right.
never really vibe with Calvinism. So
Yeah.
and I
Well,
don't
I
want to.
like,
I've read good Calvinist writers. I don't want to slam them in general,
sure.
but
Yeah.
no.
Oh, I have friends who are Calvinists. I just don't think that way of thinking makes a lot of sense. Which
Yeah.
I really like that you said that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Prior, excuse me,
Yeah, good.
prior to the pandemic, I did a lot of traveling and speaking, in universities or
Mm-hmm.
conferences or churches or whatever. And when I present the ideas of open and relational theology, the number one response I get from people is, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And
Yeah.
I think, yeah, theology that makes sense. Who would have thought?
Weird, right? It's like the mystery card. Like as soon as you don't understand something, evangelicals be like, his ways are higher than yours. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not an answer, bro. That's a cop out.
Right. I'm totally with you.
You did not push the intellectual boundaries of what you just said and you got found out. You know what I mean? Don't drop that his ways are higher than mine BS.
Yep, I totally agree.
That's just a cop out. I can't even with that. So now I have a question for you that is maybe a pivot. It was in no
Okay.
way on our list, but I'm just very curious about this because this is as someone who's only recently begun reconstructing, I'm now because I'm innately wired to be a theologian and a philosopher and a thinker. Like that's just how I'm wired. So I am now finally exploring different topics because I didn't know this whole world was out here of these different views because I was so evangelical I didn't know.
Yeah.
So I'm reconstructing how I interpret specific passages that were used to be very exclusionary and narrow in my childhood. So what do you do with the Bible verse? And I apologize if this puts you in hot water, but I think at this point we've established that you're just chatting with a friend.
That's
here.
right.
What do you do with the Bible verse that says, I am the way, the truth, and the life? No one comes to the Father except through me. I've riffed on this with a couple other people in past episodes. So I'm just curious what you would do with that verse or how it makes sense to you in relation to the journey you've taken and what you now know.
Yeah, yeah. I think when John quotes Jesus as saying this, it's in the context of Jesus being the source of abundant life, he's got all kinds of light and life and water and all these kinds of metaphors and things. I think fundamentally what's at stake here is that John is making the claims about the way of Jesus being the way of true life, abundant life, the life of love. I think Jesus, more than anyone, more perfectly than anyone, expresses love. Now, if I think God is a God of love and God wants us to love, then following the love of Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, is the way in which we find our utmost potential, our right relationship with God. I mean, we've got all kinds of phrases we can use, and some are better than others. But the way that we finally have the kind of beautiful love relationship God wants us to have, I think, is clearest in Jesus. Not the only one. I think other people also show love, and I'm I'm a pluralist in the sense that I think other traditions have truth in them.
Hmm.
But I'm most captured and captivated by this Jesus guy.
Hmm.
And that's how I interpret that particular passage.
That's great. Thank you for that. That also makes a lot of sense. I feel like I wish I would have known you about 32 years earlier.
I love
Because
it.
there's so much less unlearning to do. Not, and certainly not that I'm saying that you're perfect or this deity or something, but
No.
I didn't experience this kind of open and playful nature with theology when I was younger. It was very much like, that's it. You know what I mean? Like Wayne
Yep.
Grudem, systematic theology. That's like what I cut my teeth on. And it's just like, I
Yeah.
can't vibe with it anymore. So,
That's funny. I now direct doctoral students in open and relational theology, and
yeah.
often when students are writing their dissertation and they want to have the foil, the person that they're arguing against, I say, get Wayne Grudem.
Oh my God. Like he's the litmus test there. Like that's what here's our baseline. Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's so funny. For those of you guys who don't know, I'll let you in on a little secret. Wayne Grudem is a systematic theologian, and he's authored a book called Systematic Theology that's pretty widely used in evangelical Bible
I think
schools
it's
and
the
seminaries.
number one selling systematic theology on Amazon.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm going to seminary now. At first, I was a little bit like, this is a bummer that I have to go because, listen, I grew up like in this world. So I've already invested $80,000, which has not made me a cent, but I've invested $80,000 in an education that I can't use because the second I came out, the only church that would acknowledge my degree said, we won't acknowledge you. And so I was like, it's a bummer. I'm a little salty about this degree sometimes. So when I have to go back to seminary, which I always wanted more schooling, but it's just annoying for someone to say like, the work you did doesn't count.
Yeah.
But I'm so excited to honestly to go back and learn things from a not so narrow perspective.
Yeah.
I was meeting with my seminary class yesterday, like our incoming class. They were just having like a Zoom happy hour, and everyone was brown, female, or queer. And I was like, dude, I'm at the right seminary.
I love it.
Like so many of my friends were like, so many of my good friends that I have now are literally like protective of me. And they're like, are you sure you should go back into this environment? Because we know what you went through. And I was like, dude, seminary is like the queerest place right now, as long as you pick a good one, right? So
yeah, I love it.
I definitely noticed that you have a doctoral program in open relational theology. We'll talk about that off camera. So
okay, great.
I'm getting a doctorate one way or another, and I feel like if I'm gonna swing, I might as well swing for the heretical fences, right?
I love it.
So we have just a few minutes left here, but I want to maximize. I'm squeezing the juice out of these moments with you because it's just so refreshing to hear someone who's not scared by questions and who's not really afraid. Plus, you also think about this regularly, whether or not you get paid. So it's nice that you've had these forethoughts. But what do you think? What do you think is based on this open and relational theology idea that you've come to know and test and try? Like, what do you think that this open and relational understanding of theology has to bear into witness or to like say to the idea of like interfaith cooperation? Because I know interfaith cooperation would have never been encouraged in the type of circles I grew up in. And now for me, that's regrettable because I've found beauty in the Sufi poets, and I have such a deeper appreciation for the Torah now than I did before college. And I'm about to go into a progressive class on the Torah. Like I'm pumped for it. Like bring on the ancient Judaism, like mystics, like we're reading the Torah through a womanist lens, like all these things. So what do you think that what you've come to learn since your crisis of faith, what's that have to say about the conversation on interfaith relationships?
Yeah, open and relational theology assumes God is present everywhere to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And not just present, God is revealing everywhere to everyone. Now, because God can't control anyone, that revelation can never be absolutely crystal clear, unambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be full in the sense of giving absolute truth. That means that there's no person and no tradition that's got it absolutely 100% right. However, it could be that some of us understand better. We discern better. We're closer to the full truth than others. There could be some traditions that are closer to the full truth. We can't know this with absolute certainty,
Right.
we make these kind of assessments based on the way we see our lives, the way we live, science, all
Mm-hmm.
these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of interfaith, I think it's really important. And I think it's not just important just so we can all get along.
Right.
We actually can learn something important for ourselves
Mm-hmm.
if we interact with those of other religious traditions. And what I find is that, at least what I was told when I was younger, about how those Muslims are, or those whoever
Yep.
Buddhists are
Yep.
so radically different and they're deceived by Satan. I find that when we get down to it, there's a lot of similarities. They're not the same. I'm not saying that at all,
Mm-hmm.
but there are a lot more similarities than I would have thought when I was in junior high. And,
Mm-hmm.
my Sunday school teacher talked about how Satan is ruling all the other religions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just so reductionary, and it really bothers me because it's so presumptuous. And really, I think a lot of what I see as problematic with Christianity is really an outcropping of the doctrine of discovery and the Council of Nicaea and all of these things that I don't want to be exclusionary to people that are watching, but this is a nerd conversation. If you have questions, drop them specifically. But so much of so much that I have problems with when it comes to Christianity, I could actually parse it out as an interpretation of the Bible, right? This doctrine of discovery that gave us the freedom as white people to commit genocide to Native Americans, that gave us the audacity as white people to think that we were taking Jesus back to a continent where he probably walked. You know what I mean? Like, there's just so much audacity in that. But I think that we have so much to learn. Like I personally am really attracted to two ideas right now that I've been mulling over for a couple months. Like I'll probably write something on the topic at some point. But first of all, the idea is I talked to a Muslim friend of mine, and we had a conversation. It was actually the very first inaugural conversation. And we talked about the similarities between Islam and Christianity and what led her on her journey from actual like Protestant evangelical Christianity to Islam. And we wound back our way around to the end to where she said, like Islam does not discriminate when it's people of the book. Like and I love that idea because it's like, if we're coming together on the same majors, why do we got to fight each other? And I loved that idea that I've picked up recently from Islam. And then there's an idea of, in Judaism, they don't really focus on the afterlife. And I think Christians they have talked about the afterlife for so long as a matter of escapism and not taking responsibility for the massive tragedies that Christianity has impacted on the world, right? So if we talk about God's kingdom as a thing that is other, then we don't have to fix our Keystone Pipeline crisis. We can keep worrying about it. You know what I mean? And so I think it's not only possible, but maybe perhaps like really necessary that we have space for these intersectional transactions with people who are different and understand the world differently.
Yeah, that's nicely said. Let me throw one real quick thing in here that might be controversial to some of your people who are listening to this. What I think is really weird is that I sometimes find myself having more in common with my Mormon friends than my Baptist friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or my Buddhist friends instead of obviously my fundamentalist Christian friends.
Right.
And when you start realizing this, I think some of the boundaries begin to disappear. I want to be clear. I don't think all religions say the same thing.
Right.
I'm not saying that at all. Mm-hmm. And I'm also not trying to say every religion is just as valuable in the sense of having closer to the truth than others. I'm a Christian because I really think that this Jesus guy's got something that's profoundly different, and I think in some ways better. So this is not me just sort of ruffling over all the differences.
Right.
But you can believe that Christianity has a fuller sense of the truth and also think that you can learn something from Buddhism that you couldn't get directly from Christianity. And that's, I think, a healthy interfaith approach.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the way I've come to describe my understanding of faith is because it's not, frankly, the reason that I would ever associate with the Christian church right now is beyond my grasp, based on the experiences that I've had. But there's something in me that's like, you got to make this make sense. So I've kind of, once again, in my studies when it comes to culture versus religion, I've kind of come to understand that, like, I will always culturally be a Christian. I don't have an ethnic identity, which is really, It's a travesty that happened because of whitewashing that took place when America decided to create race to divide the black slaves and the white indentured servants. Not that I'm on a soapbox about that, but I don't have an ethnic identity because of that. And so my only real heritage and identity is cultural Christianity.
Interesting.
And so I've been winding my way around that, but I've come to understand that if I can understand it as a culture, I can free myself from a lot of shame, because Christianity will just always be my first language. It's not that I can't learn another, but I'll always default to my first language. I'll always speak with a Christian accent because that's what I grew up in. And so I kind of have taken this sociological and anthropological view to my faith, and that's been redemptive for me, because otherwise, if I just look at it, man, I was an ass. Like, I wore a shirt that said abortion is homicide. When my friend came out to me in college, she was like, aren't you gay? And I was like, no, but like, it's okay. Like, it's not like God doesn't like it, but he likes you. And I'm like, I've just said and done some damaging stuff. Yeah. But if I understand it as how I was cultured, I can find some forgiveness for myself by viewing it that way.
That's good, Leo. I like that. Yeah.
It's been a big healing process. I've got a great counselor who lets me text her. I'm like, can we put this in our notes for next session? So she'll get like 8 texts from me, and I'm like, I want to talk about this in 2 weeks. But it's been a process. But now, like I said, I think I mentioned this at the beginning. This summer, there was at the George Floyd protest in our town, there was no religious presence there, and I'm not saying there's no good pastors in my town, because there's a couple of good ones, right? But they're bound by their vestries and they're bound by their board or whatever. And so this summer I was like, well, fuck it. I have a degree, and I also have a little badge that cost me $20 from the Universal Life Church. I'm gonna get myself a collar and I'm gonna show up at the protest. And since
I love it.
You know what I mean? Since then I've almost embraced this sassy side that said, you're not going to disenfranchise me from my culture. And I don't even know if I like it all the time, but it's mine. Well, so here we are. It's really good to hear those thoughts, though. We have about 9 more minutes, but I have 2 questions.
Okay.
Would you
I'll
mind?
make my answers quick.
Perfect. There's time limits are artificial here, but I'm just letting you know. I do have 2 questions. What do you have in common with your Mormon friends, and what do you have in common, or have you learned from your Buddhist friends? Just out of curiosity.
Mormon friends, real quickly, there's more than what I'm going to say right now. The Mormon tradition has an emphasis upon free will. I think that's important to make sense of. Some of my Baptist friends don't have that.
Yep.
Mormons have a God who is relational, who suffers with us. Some of my Catholic friends don't have that. Mormons, this is going to be a wild one for you. Mormons reject the idea of creation out of nothing. I also reject the idea of creation out of nothing. So there's 3 quick things.
Yeah.
Buddhism has a fundamental view that all things flow, that we move through time. They also have a strong relationality in them, and both of those things are fundamental about how I think about God and reality. And they also have at least there's a tradition of compassion, karuna is what they call it, that I think is important. So real quickly,
that's super cool. Thank you. We have in the process of conversations, it just really mirrors me. We actually started in 2010. And Conversations was a young adult small group that I ran for about 5 years. We had a core group of 30 to 40 people. We took 2 or 3 missions trips. Yearly, we would take a missions trip. Monthly, we would serve at our soup kitchen, and all of it was done without any preconceptions of who you had to be to join. It was actually frequently it was a gaggle of lesbians, because I was lesbian, and
sure.
That's who was coming. But since we've evolved into this digital age, COVID really provided us a way to kind of pivot and relaunch in a new direction and reach a broader group. But what I'm doing with my next year of Conversations is we're starting from our Western faiths and our Abrahamic faiths, and then we're working outwards. So I have some 3-way panels set up with an LGBTQ Muslim, LGBTQ Hasidic Jew, and then myself. And we're going to dialogue on culture and religion one week, and then the next week we're going to talk about our coming out stories. And we're doing that in the holy season, right? So right before Ramadan, so that our Muslim friends can participate. And then we're blowing it out to those like Eastern understandings. So as I find more people, we're blowing it out. And so it's really cool to hear you present those perspectives, because just to acknowledge, there's once again, there's this lack of acknowledgement from like a lot of white Western Christianity that there's any good thought anywhere else. Like if it didn't come from a white man who sang Germanic hymns, like if your church doesn't sing hymns that were written by a German or sung in a bar, like you can't, no, that's crazy. It's so presumptuous. So presumptuous. So awesome. I had one other thought for you, but it's like escaping me. Oh yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Okay, I got it back. The train is back on track. But I think one of the downfalls of Christianity is the way that we've dealt with the actual spiritual component of our religion. And I think a lot of times there's moments where the church veered so heavily into ritual that it forgot spontaneity and room for spirituality and experience and nuance, and making movements like I'm dancing. We forgot that. And then so that's one way. And then the other way, we just went fucking crazy and started playing with snakes. You know what I mean? I think that it happened. We gotta own up to it. Like I don't claim those people, but they're cousins, Yeah. But I think that's one way that the church lost postmodern folks is they truncated this idea of like what you feel from what you do, which in psychology, that's where you end up with dysfunction. It's a mental disorder. When you separate what you feel and what you do, you feel systemic psychological fallout. And I think the church lost postmodern folks in that truncation of those, the things we believe and the things that we feel and things that we do. So that was just amusing on my part, but.
Well, I'll do a quick musing in response.
I'm ready. I'm ready for it.
At the very heart of open and relational theology, at least in terms of as it thinks about the method of it, is the notion that our experiences are fundamental. They really matter. Yes, ideas matter. Yes, rituals matter. But fundamentally, our experiences tell us truth about who God is and the way the world works. And we've already been talking about this in the last hour and a half when we've talked about, what's loving for us ought to be loving for God. That's another way of saying, let's take our own experiences of love and morality and let's say God also has to measure up to what's loving.
Yeah.
So I like your emphasis upon experience.
Yeah, you have to, because you can take so many things from a person, but you can never take away what they actually experienced.
Right. Yep.
I don't know if a bunch of people in the Midwest saw UFOs, but I can't take away whatever happened. I can try to explain it away, but I can't take it away.
Sure.
And I love the idea of there's a campaign, and I'm not sure if it's just a United Church of Christ campaign, but I saw the banner in my friend Pastor Adam's live video. He's the dude that makes all those inflammatory church signs in Clackamas, Oregon, as it goes viral for our transgender siblings have heartbeats or whatever. He came on the podcast a while ago, but whatever. But in the back of his office, he had a sign that says God is still speaking. And in the line of not being presumptuous, I think that God reveals God's self to us through all sorts of things. Right? God is still speaking, and our experiences are the operating software for which we understand our, God, right? God comes into our experience or is there already, depending on, this is getting too deep, but God in our experiences are a thing that come together. And I love that open and relational theology provides validity to that, because you can say I'm not a gay Christian, but I'm going to say you're crazy.
Right.
you can argue rights or wrongs. This is an early part of my deconstruction. Perhaps maybe step 3 is you can argue the rights or wrongs of gay Christians, but you can't say I don't exist. Hi, you know what I mean? And now that I'm healed a little bit, my position towards the church is you've got to deal with me.
Yeah.
you can hate me, love me, or hate me. You've got to deal with me, because I can quote the scripture as well as you can, maybe even better. When people try to argue with me about if it's okay to be gay and Christian, and then they try to quote the King James version at me, I'm like, hold up, you think the Bible was written in English? Get the fuck out of here. I don't care. Love me or hate me. You cannot just deny my whole existence.
Yep.
Maybe I'm demon possessed. Maybe that's how you deal with me. Maybe I'm evil. That's how you deal with me. Maybe I'm delusional. That's how you deal with me. But I'm here. You got to deal with it. And I like that and I say but I like this understanding of open and relational theology gives some sort of validation and sanctification to our experiences as sentient beings who have equal access to divinity.
Yep. Well put.
I had to say.
By the way, was that Clackamas pastor Adam Erickson?
Yeah, Adam Erickson. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Love that
I've
guy.
preached for his church via early part of the pandemic.
Oh, that's so cool. I was just on, he came on my podcast. He's like maybe the second or third person. Listen, I've thrown out Hail Marys. Barack Obama has been invited to my podcast. Oprah has been invited to my podcast.
Good
like the
for
worst
you.
thing people can do is say no. But the first Hail Mary I threw out was Pastor Adam, and he like came on and it was dope. And we started this friendship. And he's had me on his podcast twice. Like he's
good.
Oh, yeah. I really dig them. It's kind of funny when you run into people who know people, and the internet makes that even more possible. So, well, thank you so much, Thomas. There's no words for me to express how much I appreciate your willingness to just have a candid conversation. I frequently prefer them to scripted ones, even slightly scripted ones, because part of the reason I chose the word conversations is that if you look up the definition of conversations, this is such a standard pastor move. Like, let me look up the definition and then preach on it.
I love it.
Dyed in the wool pastor's kid. But if you look up the definition of conversations, it talks about how communication between one or more people or parties, verbal and nonverbal, and what comes after the comma is that it must proceed at least in some part spontaneously. And I love the beauty of the spontaneity that comes out in a conversation. And that's why I called conversations, because it's not planned. There's no prerequisites. You just show up. So thank you for showing up. And I appreciate the work you've done.
It's been my honor. I've really enjoyed our time together.
Good. We'll have to make it happen again for sure. I know I'm going to be in your inbox about open and relational theology because I'm reconstructing and I'm trying to get that doctorate eventually. So give me 3 years. We'll know what's up. But I'm just going to provide a little quick outro and then we'll say goodbye. So for everyone that's been watching, this is Conversations. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to have spiritually minded conversations about life. Don't get it twisted. Spiritual is just anything that you can't taste, touch, or see. So no matter who you are, there's space for you at this table. And no matter what questions you have, this is a safe space to bring them up, because we're going to meet you with love and compassion every time. And if we don't meet you with love and compassion, whoever came at you sideways is getting kicked out. That is the only prerequisite. You might have noticed that I have a Conversations hat on right now. If you go to conversationsofficial.com, you can pick up some Conversations merchandise. What's dope about the Conversations merchandise is that all the money that comes in is going to allow us to make Conversations accessible to a wider group of people by funding transcription and captioning services so that we can be accessible to people who have hearing difficulties. Currently, we're accessible to a lot of people, but we don't have any platforms that are accessible to people who have a hard time hearing. So if you happen to purchase some Conversations merch, we can get that popping. If you have any questions for me, you can drop them at conversationsofficial.com. You can slide into my inbox on Facebook. I'm here and I'm accessible, and I don't have all the answers, but I definitely have the compassion. Thomas, is there a way that folks can get in touch with you if they'd like to speak with you more or follow your work?
Sure. I have a personal website that's my full name, Thomas Jay Oord, and you spell my last name Oord. You could also just Google Center for Open and Relational Theology. I'm pretty accessible via social media. So if you look very hard, you can probably find my email address or just send me a private note.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on, Thomas. Thank you, everybody, for watching live. And for those of you who are going to watch on the replay, thank you for being a part of the conversation. It would just be me talking a lot if you weren't here. Everybody, thank you so much. Have a good day. And most importantly, go Bills. Have a good day, everybody. This has been the Conversations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.